were fortunate enough to come back, be able to start their business back up, and then in 1962 purchased this building and opened Import Plaza. For those of you who've been around, you might remember my family's business. So for close to 50 years, they operated Import Plaza, and then Market kind of drove it, they closed it. And so the building sat vacant, and long story short, OCOM has actually invested in this neighborhood, purchased this building for the campus, and it was a long, arduous 6-year process that I can't believe that they're here. Actually, there's close to 400 people who come here every day during the week, and they're, close to 24,000 visits to their clinics. So what they're doing is really giving back to the community. They're a nonprofit. They have 275 students who are master's and doctoral students who are learning here. So it's just been absolutely marvelous. And they also historically renovated this building to Gold LEED status, which is incredible. And so it's really a pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Livingston. And we run into each other around town. So, and his son is here, and I think he's a doll because he's a hopper like me. That's a half breed. So, anyway, okay.
Okay, thanks, Anne.
Sure.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Some of you I've seen before, and hopefully for those of you who've been to some of my lectures, this won't be too boring. But, I always try to entertain and give some useful knowledge. Because Chinese medicine, a lot of it's very esoteric, but difficult to understand unless you spend years submersed in it. But there's a lot of it that's actually pretty accessible, and there's a lot of accessible, practical knowledge there that can help people stay well without going to doctors. And I'm a big supporter or fan of having people not go to doctors. Not that you shouldn't go to a doctor. Every once in a while you need to go for a checkup, that sort of thing. Should do that. But shouldn't rely 100% on doctors for your health and well-being. But then who do you rely on? What do you do? You have to have some instruction in how to take care of yourself, right? Because you're not born with a little manual in hand. Like you buy a car, you got a manual. You get a computer, you have a manual there. You go to the bookstore and buy a manual. And you can go to bookstores, of course, and buy books about medicine and health and taking care of yourself. But Chinese medicine has a lot to offer in that area, and especially around prevention. And of course, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Is that the saying? So, from very early on, Chinese medicine emphasized prevention. And so we'll talk about some of that. So, the practice of medicine in China from the beginning, this idea actually comes from the Ni Jing. Can everyone hear me okay?
No.
Maybe I'll use the mic then, because otherwise I'll end up hoarse. Is that better? Now everyone can hear me. Okay. So there's an old book which is sort of equivalent to the Bible of Chinese medicine. We call Huangdi Ni Jing, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon. So it's about 2,000 to 2,500 years old. It's compiled over some hundreds of years. In that book, sort of lays down the foundations of Chinese medicine about physiology and the causes of disease and acupuncture channels and
treatment methods and all this kind of thing. And in there, there's some philosophy about the practice of medicine as well. And the Neijing says the superior physician treats before disease has begun. So as long ago as at least 2,000 years, Chinese medicine had this emphasis on treating before there's disease. So that's preventative medicine, right? And then the middle physician treats disease that's already present, right? You can't see it coming, so then all you can do is treat things that are already there, right? That's sort of doing a so-so job. And the inferior physician treats symptomatically. A lot of our medical care, sadly, falls into this realm. It's also not fair, though, to just say, for example, that Western medicine doesn't try to do this. Western medicine also has some, they would like, I think, most physicians, Western medicine physicians, would like to be able to help their patients prevent disease. Let me just turn this down a little bit because we're going to get some feedback. Maybe that's better. Is that okay?
A little bit more. Here, I get it.
How's that? Is that better? Still too low? Still too low.
I'm turning really slowly.
Oh, yeah, go up a little more now. Okay, that's better. Yeah, that's probably good, right? Now it's good? Okay. So it's not that Western medicine doesn't have preventative medicine, but they're somewhat limited because their understanding of physiology and is different than Chinese medicine. And it doesn't lend itself to seeing things well in advance, seeing where you are now and where you're likely to go. Chinese medicine is somehow very well suited to do that. I'll try to explain why that is. But Chinese medicine is very well suited for that. And Western medicine, primarily, relying on lab tests and some MRI, CT, something like that, you really can only see some problem once it's actually surfaced. Right? Once there's actually something that you can visibly see or measure, when those things start to go wrong, then okay, we can start to do something about it. But in terms of trying to keep you from even getting to that stage, they haven't got a lot to offer. I just remember, it's really one of my last interactions with a medical doctor before I started studying Chinese medicine. I think it was about 19 or 20. And I wasn't actually feeling all that well. I felt very tired and kind of run down. And I went to my GP, and they did an exam. They said, "Oh, you're the picture of health." Well, okay, I don't have a tumor, and I don't have diabetes, but I don't feel like a picture of health either. So, I thought, that's nice. I'm not dying. So you definitely need MDs to rule out very serious problems, right? And make sure that you haven't got a tumor, that your blood sugar is okay, like that. But in terms of just, if you're not feeling very well, just generally feel a little fatigued or something's not quite right, oftentimes they can't figure out what's wrong with you. But Chinese medicine usually can. That doesn't mean that Chinese medicine can always fix it. It's not that Chinese medicine is a panacea, but usually we can see what the problem is, and then at least we can have a go at it. And then sometimes, in fact very often, you can help those kinds of problems. And then, of course, like I said, because Chinese medicine is not some magical panacea, you can't help everything, but you can at least have a go, right? So in any case, Chinese medicine's able to detect subtle problems before overt symptoms or disease are present. And I'll explain why in a second. And then we use either medicine, actual medical intervention like herbs or acupuncture or some massage or something like that, or some health cultivation techniques, which we'll talk about in a bit, to remedy those subtle imbalances so that they don't become big imbalances and big problems and overt disease. Right? So why is Chinese medicine good at determining or seeing those little problems? Well, first, let me just explain. Chinese medicine is its own complete independent medical system. And it has its own understanding of physiology, which is, it's not that there's, two human bodies. It's just the lens that Chinese medicine looks through. It's not like there's a Western medicine body and then you have a Chinese medicine. It's one thing, right? It's just a different way of looking at it, different way of organizing what you see and seeing relationships between things. But Chinese medicine physiology, because it's so ancient, and they didn't have modern science and technology, they had to figure out some other way of understanding the human body. And it naturally developed, they developed this holistic view of physiology. And they can see connections between things. And Western medicine is very different. It's kind of like if the body's a forest, then Western medicine is down in the forest. And you can see every little leaf and rock and pebble, and you can analyze every little thing. But then there's a lot of information there, right? And you're looking at all those little things. You can't possibly then see the whole forest. You can't see the forest through the trees, right? And that's useful. It's very useful to be able to look at some minute things sometimes. It's not that that's a bad thing, but there's so much information there that you can't possibly put it all together into a holistic view of the human body. Right? But Chinese medicine is completely the opposite. Chinese medicine had no way of looking at the minutiae. This just wasn't an option. You don't have the tools to do it. So Chinese medicine is kind of standing on the hilltop over the forest, and you can see the whole forest, and you can see the relationships between these big parts and everything. But you can't see the minutiae, but you can see the relationships there. So you can see, this part of the forest somehow is turning brown, and you can see that this little creek here, there's a dam there. Somehow a bunch of rubble and debris, whatever, collected there and blocked the little creek. So now this part of the forest is drying up. You can't go down there and analyze every little, stick and rock in that dam, but you can see that there's a blockage there, and then you just try to unblock that, and then the forest is happy again. So it's a little bit like that. And it's not to say that that's necessarily, better than the Western medicine model. It's just different. There's strengths to that, but there's also weakness to that, because you can't go in there and see the tiny little stuff. So it's not that Chinese medicine is better than Western medicine or vice versa. It's just they each have their strengths and weaknesses. And then as a doctor, you need to know what those are. That's your responsibility as a doctor, to know what the strengths and weaknesses of whatever system of medicine you practice are. And then you can help guide your patients in whatever, to do whatever they need to do. And I think that's one of the big problems with Western medicine, especially in the West. Not so much in China, because in China they integrate a lot, but in the West especially, the medical doctors tend to be ignorant of other systems of medicine. And then they don't know when to send their patients to other kinds of medical practitioners. That's, in my mind, that's not a really good way to practice, I'm very quick to refer my patients to MDs, to osteopaths, to naturopaths, something like that. Because I don't know everything. I know Chinese medicine quite well, but I don't know Western medicine nearly as well as an MD. Okay. And then Chinese medicine also has its own understanding of the of etiology, the causes of disease. And that's very important when it comes to prevention, because if you understand the causes of disease, then you can intervene and try to prevent disease, right? If you decide that, okay, cold is a cause of disease, then you can help people avoid cold or whatever it is, right? So that's very important. We'll talk about that more. And then Chinese medicine has its own understanding about the mechanism of disease, and that's also important because if you understand how disease develops, then you can intervene early. And again, Chinese medicine has a different view of that than Western medicine, and there's a lot of interventions that you can do early on, long before you have some overt problem that will help prevent medicine. And then Chinese medicine has its own system of diagnosis, and that also plays a part in prevention. We'll talk about that in a minute. And also with treatment. So first, with etiology, as I said, if you understand the cause of disease, you can help, that helps you to avoid getting sick, right? You can avoid those causes. And Chinese medicine categorizes those things into there's three categories. External causes, internal causes, and miscellaneous causes. Of course, this is very ancient. So long before anyone knew about bacteria and viruses and those sorts of things. So there wasn't any option of making a category for that. Right? The ancient Chinese had to, just with their worldview and their knowledge from some couple thousand years ago, they had to say, what is it that's causing people to get sick, right? And they said, well, there's three categories. So external causes they call the Liu Yin, which roughly translates as the six evils. But they're basically some external or exogenous, that's kind of a fancy word, external pathogenic factors. Or some people translate it as climatic factors. That would be cold and heat and wind and dryness and summer heat and dampness. There's 6 of them. And they are at once the actual climate. Because in fact, the climate can make you sick. Like you go out in 120-degree weather and hike around in the sun, you're going to get a heat stroke, right? And you go out in the cold without enough clothes, you get pneumonia. And if you live in some very cold, damp place, like sailors very often end up with some arthritis, right? They're always on a boat, some cold, damp weather. So in fact, the weather does affect your physiology. And there's no doubt about that. Even, it sounds a little weird, but even Western medicine recognizes that. Science recognizes that. Like, if you jump into ice water, you will eventually develop hypothermia, right? And you can die from that. So it's not like some climatic factors can't affect your body. Your body's constantly interacting with the environment. So when it's cold, the blood vessels on the surface of your body contract and shunt the blood away from the surface of the body so you can conserve body heat. And when it's hot, the opposite happens. All the blood vessels dilate, the pores open, and you sweat easily. So your body's constantly trying to regulate itself in relation to the environment. So the environment definitely affects you, and it can affect you in a bad way too. It's also a good thing. It's good to have a little exposure to cold or heat or those kind of things, but not too much. Right? And then also in here really would be things like viruses and bacteria and those kind of things. But the ancients didn't know about that. But they knew that there was something out there that would invade the body and make you sick. But they didn't have microscopes and all that kind of stuff, so they're just like, oh, that must be like one of these 6 environmental factors, or 6 pathogenic factors. It's got to be those things. And that's forgivable, right? 2,000 years ago, we probably would have come up, if we were smart and thought about it, we probably would have come up with the same thing, right? I mean, you would have been hard pressed to come up with some idea about bacteria 2,000 years ago, right? That didn't happen in the West, I think, until probably the 17th century, somewhere around there, like 16th, 17th century, or later maybe. Yeah, it might have even been the 18th century. Yeah, I think maybe it's the 18th century. I think there was a Dutch scientist who discovered bacteria. Accidentally, completely accidentally. He had a microscope. It was like a German guy had made a microscope and he got a hold of one. And actually, he wasn't even a scientist. I take it back. He was like I think he was a baker, but it was like his hobby to look at everything under a microscope. And a lot of scientists had microscopes, and none of them ever thought to look at a drop of water. But this guy looked at a drop of water, and he saw all these little animals in there. But he thought they were animals. He said, "There's these tiny little animals in the water." And then he was the first one to notice that, right? I think that's actually 18th century, or maybe even early 19th century. I'm not sure, but it's not that long ago. So the fact that the ancient Chinese, ascribe those things to, some environmental factor is pretty acceptable or forgivable, maybe. And then the internal causes are simply emotions. But of course, the emotions that's normal. You should have, normal, healthy emotions. But when they're extreme in some way, then they cause pathological changes, right? And even now, the science is recognizing that, like stress causes disease, right? And things like, for example, irritable bowel syndrome. That's a very easy one to see, where these people get some stress, anxiety, and then they have cramping and diarrhea, right? And most people have experienced how stress will affect their digestive system. They get really stressed out, you lose your appetite, maybe even become nauseous, some extreme case, maybe even vomit, right? But stress, and not just stress, but all kind of extreme emotion has an effect on your physiology, an adverse effect, I should say. Normal emotion, of course, also affects your physiology, but not necessarily in an adverse way, right? And then there's these miscellaneous causes, like improper diet and overwork. Actually, should add to that lack of exercise. I didn't put that in there. Excessive sexual activity, also, and injuries, animal insect bites. So we'll talk a little bit more about how those things can affect you and in what way and how to avoid those things a bit later. But I just wanted to briefly go over this etiology thing first. And then, because I want to get to sort of like why Chinese medicine is good at prevention. So then that brings us to the examination in Chinese medicine. And in Chinese medicine, like any medicine, in order to make a diagnosis, you have to gather diagnostic information. Right? And in order to prevent disease, you have to be able to make a diagnosis on somebody as well. Of course, you can just do like a sort of standard things that are good for everybody, right? Like proper diet, proper exercise, proper rest. That's good for everybody. But if you really want to see a person, an individual, and see where they're at any particular given moment in time, and then help them prevent some problem coming later, then you need to be able to make a diagnosis. Right? That's more specialized than just the sort of general health cultivation activities like diet and exercise. So Chinese medicine doctors, like any doctor, gather information about a person, but they didn't have any modern technology, so they had to use their senses. Right? So they used observation. They look at the patient, look at the face, look at the hand, look at the nails, look at the tongue, look at the eyes, look at the type of body, all those kind of things you can observe. And then you listen and smell, it gives you some information. And you can ask all different kinds of questions about appetite and digestion and bowel movement and sleep and this and that, right? And then palpation is touch. You can palpate abdomen or acupuncture points, or maybe most famously, it's palpating the radial artery on the wrist. It's pulse diagnosis. And all that information together helps you come to a diagnosis. And the diagnosis in Chinese medicine is very unique, and this is what in some way really is, it's what makes Chinese medicine so good at prevention. And it's this syndrome differentiation. In Chinese we call 辩证. 辩 means to differentiate, and 症 roughly translates to syndrome, or sometimes it gets translated as pattern. But Chinese medicine doesn't, Chinese medicine did make, and still does, make disease diagnosis. For example, migraine headache would be a disease, or diabetes, that's a disease. And the ancients did recognize diabetes. They didn't call it diabetes, they called it 消渴, it's wasting and thirsting. They recognized that there's this conglomeration of signs and symptoms that we now recognize, and now we call diabetes. The ancients called that 消渴. So they recognize diseases, but a disease is not a very useful diagnosis in Chinese medicine. It's somewhat helpful, but in the end you have to diagnose this pattern, because first of all, this is a kind of holistic view of a person's body. A disease tends to be just sort of like one aspect of a person's body, one thing that's not going well. It's not the whole picture. So this zheng, this pattern or syndrome, is the whole picture, exactly everything that's going on in your body at any given moment in time. So it's holistic and completely individualized. And it's very subtle. So even you haven't got any health problem, you think you're the picture of health, you can still 辩证. You can still do this differentiation of pattern. And you can see some very subtle imbalance long before you have any overt problem. For example, when I was 19, if I had gone to a Chinese medicine doctor at that time, they would have very easily seen what was wrong with me. Like, oh, I have some qi deficiency. Which, okay, qi deficiency, that's not very specific, right? Or it is actually in its own way. It's not specific from that biomedical view, right? That's standing up on the top of the mountain here. Oh, the qi is deficient. It's not down there, looking at every needle. You won't find the problem down there looking at every leaf and rock. You can't see the problem there. You look, oh, all the leaves look pretty much okay. Like, all our instruments say the leaves are fine. Right? But then you step back and on the mountain you're like, oh, actually, those leaves are starting to turn a little yellow. And that's because this problem here, there's not enough qi over here somehow, right? And maybe that's not a very satisfactory explanation for people that really want that kind of scientific explanation. But it's still a real explanation in fact. It's just a different way of talking about things. That doesn't make it metaphysical or somehow like a mystical or magical or something. It's just a different lens, right? So in any case, we have to make this syndrome differentiation. And why is that different than the disease differentiation? Because in Chinese medicine we have this saying, 同病异治，以病通之, means same disease, different treatment. Because 10 people, or maybe 100 people with the same disease, say diabetes, will all have different zheng, all have different pattern or syndrome. There may be similarities because when diseases do tend to have some kind of trend. So there can be similarities between those 100 people, but there also can be really big differences, even sometimes completely polar opposite differences, where if you gave the same treatment to all of those people, then you'd be making a big mistake, because some of them are on the cold side and some of them are on the hot side, and some of them are deficient and some of them are excess. So the treatments can be completely opposite for the same disease, because Chinese medicine doesn't treat the disease, we treat this syndrome. Chinese medicine always goes after this syndrome or pattern. That's what makes Chinese medicine unique. That's what separates it from any other kind of medicine. And I don't know, maybe Ayurvedic is a little bit similar to that, and there may be some other kinds of traditional medicine out there that I'm not aware of that have similar way of working. This is very different than Western medicine, that's for sure. Western medicine, they tend to look at disease and then they'll try to find some small thing in there they can tweak, and that's going to rectify the problem. But Chinese medicine is not doing that at all. We don't worry too much about the actual disease. We worry about, why did this disease start? What's at the bottom of this problem? What's the root of this problem? At the root of any problem is this pattern. That's at the root of any problem. So if you can treat that, then you should be able to treat the disease, right? And again, it's not to say that Chinese medicine is magical and all disease can be cured through this method. Right? Otherwise, there'd be all kinds of immortals running around in China and stuff like that. And there aren't, so it's not like that, but it's still very useful. And this is why we can prevent things, because this pattern is so subtle that, like I said, long before you have some overt symptom, we can make a diagnosis. So anyone in this room can make a diagnosis. Even you feel completely fine. You can still see, oh, the spleen qi is a little weak, there's a little dampness, tendency towards yin deficiency or qi stagnation. And then you can rectify those things. Say, okay, you have a tendency towards dampness, whatever that is, right? That's like one of those 6 pathogenic factors, right? But, okay, whatever that is, in Chinese medicine, we can see that thing. Even we can't tell you exactly what it is from a biomedical perspective, but we can see that that's there, and then we can help you resolve that. So, okay, you have dampness, you probably shouldn't eat cheesecake. You should eat more vegetables and rice, and not so much really rich food and hard to digest food. Okay. And then eventually, if you do that, then the dampness goes away. And then you can prevent some problem, because if you have a lot of dampness accumulating in your body, over time, the dampness tend to accumulate and form phlegm. And then phlegm stagnate, get some blood stagnation. And then phlegm and blood stagnation together, get some heat. And then eventually the heat becomes toxic heat, and you've got cancer. Cancer is usually phlegm and blood stagnation and toxic heat all mixed together. Right? So if you could see at the very, very early stage, oh, this person, has a lot of dampness, and you try to clean that out, then maybe you can't really tell, because it's like, you wouldn't have known that this person was going to get cancer anyway, right? But better to not take any chances. Just clean up the dampness, get the blood moving, make the qi and blood strong, make the body strong. Then, okay, you're certainly better off, right? You have a better chance of not developing some sickness. You wouldn't be able to say, oh, Chinese medicine prevented my disease, because you wouldn't have known what would happen if you didn't do that. But the proof is still in the pudding, because a lot of Chinese medicine doctors live to over 100 years old. And they know how to take care of themselves and prevent disease. And even in ancient times, there's some doctors, like in Europe, if you lived to be over 40 back then, it was a big deal, and Chinese living to be over 100, because they know this stuff, how to take care of themselves. So there's something to it for sure, even if you can't necessarily explain it in modern terms. And then once you have an idea of what's going on with someone, then you can figure out how to help them, right? And there's 5 branches of treatment in Chinese medicine. And I list them here in order from least to most invasive. The first is Qigong, which people in Portland probably heard Qigong, because Portland's pretty progressive, right? There's like a lot of people doing Qigong out there. You go to the park and you see some people doing that, or hugging a tree, doing Qigong on a tree or something, right? But Qigong is really anything that you do. There's these, Qigong exercises, and you can study with like a Qigong master or something. Those are people that develop certain, specific exercises, right? I call them exercises, but whatever they are, there's some practice, right? That has an intentional effect on your physiology. Like this thing should affect your physiology in a good way, if you do it the right way, and should have a good effect on your physiology, right? And then, they go around and teach people. That's, modern idea of Qigong. But actually, everything you do is Qigong, because everything you do affects your physiology, affects your Qi. In Chinese medicine, when we talk about Qi, it's really just everything that's going on in your body. That's Qi. Everything is Qi. So everything, all your physiological process, everything, all of that is Qi. And everything that you do, like sitting there listening to me, that's affecting your Qi. And when you get up in the morning and you're brushing your teeth, that actually does something to your Qi. Maybe not a lot, but it does something. Or like sitting in a car in rush hour traffic. I always use that example. It's a worn out example, but that definitely affects your Qi too, right? Your blood vessels contract and your blood pressure goes up. That's affecting your Qi. That's also Qigong, but not a healthy Qigong, right? So everything you do is actually Qigong. Everything you do affects your physiology. So it's, like being mindful about what you do and how those things affect your body. It's important. But in any case, there's various practices, like actual Qigong practices, but you can just anything that's good for your body, like a walk in the park, and some little meditation, relaxation, or listen to some music you like. Anything like that can be Qigong, right? Anything that lifts your spirit, make you feel good, it should be good for you, right? So Chinese medicine doctors often teach their patients about something that they can do to help on this level. And that's the least invasive thing you can do for somebody, right? You're just telling them to take a walk in the park or something. It's not very invasive medical procedure, right? Okay. Then the next thing would be food. And Chinese medicine has a lot to say about food, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. That's very important because it's not that foods are so potent like some chemotherapy drug or something like that, right? But you eat them every day for your whole life, so the cumulative effect is huge, right? So it's very important to understand about food. And we'll talk about digestive physiology in a bit, and what Chinese medicine thinks about food. And then there's these manual therapies called tuina. Some massage, bone medicine, that kind of thing falls in there. And acupuncture, right? That's the next one. Moxibustion is using heat to stimulate the body. And then lastly is herbs. That's considered most invasive. That's considered more invasive than acupuncture, which, I don't know, maybe for some people that seems counterintuitive. But maybe other people think that makes perfect sense, but I'll explain it. Acupuncture, of course you're poking needles into people. That's fairly invasive, right? So it's down here below these three. Right? But the way acupuncture works is really just by stimulating your body. There's nothing in that needle. It's just a solid filiform needle. There's no medicine in there. You're not putting something in the body. You're just puncturing the body. And then the body responds. So you're just stimulating the body to do something on its own. Right? That's considered less invasive than herbs, because herbs are actually chemicals. And you take that internally, and they go into your blood. And that's much more invasive than acupuncture, and also much more likely to have side effects. It's very hard to have side effects with acupuncture. You can, but it's not so common. And even a bad acupuncture treatment, maybe you feel a little funky for the afternoon, but very quickly you feel okay. There's some exceptions to that, but usually it's hard to mess people up with acupuncture. It's very easy to mess people up with herbs. Very easy. Right? Like, I can teach you to do acupuncture in 5 minutes. You won't be very good at it, but 5 minutes and you could put a needle in someone, and probably you will get a good result. You might not be able to go out and open a shop and start doing it with much, with consistent results. But even if we just, in 5 minutes I teach you some ear acupuncture, and you learn, say, 5 acupuncture points, and you only know those 5 acupuncture points, and you go around and you put ear needles in those 5 points on everybody you meet, you'll probably end up helping some people with that. But I cannot teach you herbs in 5 minutes. I can't teach you herb in 5 years. You need 10 to 20 years to get good at herbal medicine. That's really, really hard, and it's very easy to mess people up. You give people the wrong herbs, you send them to the hospital. So that's definitely more invasive than acupuncture, right? That's also why there's not very many good herbalists around. There's lots of acupuncturists around, and lots of them are good, but not many good herbalists in the U.S. There's some, but not like in China. There's a hierarchy in medicine, just like here. If you graduated from Harvard, there's a hierarchy. If you're graduated from Harvard Medical School, then you look down on everybody else, right? And if you graduated from some second-tier medical school, then they look down on all the foreign-trained medical doctors. Like the foreign-trained medical doctors at the bottom, right? Like the internal medicine doctors are kind of look down on the surgeons, because surgeons are kind of like technical people. They can't really diagnose, they just can cut people open and stuff. So there's definitely hierarchy. In Chinese medicine, there is too. The herbal doctor is at the top. Very clearly in China, all the top doctors in China is the herbal doctor. And the acupuncturist is like, oh yeah, you couldn't hack it in the herbal department, so you have to study acupuncture. It's kind of like, it is like that. You only study acupuncture in China if you either have a particular interest in it, which is fine, because acupuncture is actually great. I think acupuncture is fantastic. You have a particular interest in it, so you go and study it. Or you couldn't hack they call it Zhongyi Xi, the Chinese medicine track, which is the herbal track in the university. So there's a definite hierarchy there. That's just because herbal medicine is harder to practice. It's much more demanding. Your diagnosis has to be really good. Otherwise you mess people up. So anyway. So back to this. So we detect subtle imbalance, and then by and large, if it's early enough, then we use these health cultivation techniques. They're diet and lifestyle practices, essentially, to prevent illness, to promote wellness, and to promote longevity, too. And there's 3 very famous doctors here that wrote a lot about health cultivation. The first one is Sun Simiao. He's a Tang Dynasty guy. So that's almost 1300 years ago, 1300 years ago, about the 8th century. And he wrote volumes and volumes about health cultivation, and he himself lived to be over 100. And he lived to be 102 or something like that. And then Fasan is also a Tang Dynasty physician. He's actually an imperial physician. So the emperors had many doctors, but he was one of them. And he lived to be 105. And then Gan Zhuang is still alive. He's in Shanghai. And he's somewhere around 105 now. And he writes, maybe not anymore, but he wrote a lot about health cultivation techniques. So all these guys, they study health cultivation and end up, they have good genes too. You can't do that without good genes. But if you have good genes and you don't follow that, it's kind of a waste, you don't live your allotted years, right? You end up leaving before your time. But if you have good genes and you follow that kind of thing, then people should easily be able to live to be 100 years old. If you have the genes and you know how to do it, and you don't live next to Fukushima, right? Then you're okay. You don't want to live next to some toxic situation, right? Or next to a freeway or something, right? So health cultivation, let's talk more about this because this is the very practical part that you can take home and start doing things for yourself, right? So there's a few aspects to this: diet, sleep, dress, physical activity, bathing, and then there's practices that are unique to women. We'll talk about each of these things. So first about diet. Foods have an effect on your physiology. Even the MDs don't give this a lot of weight. Some of them do. It's not even their fault. It's not taught much in medical school. But Chinese medicine talks a lot about this. And Chinese people themselves are obsessed with it. Most Chinese people have a fairly strong working knowledge of food. Just the average Chinese person. You go, out to dinner with just some random person, and then I'm going to order this, and because we're ordering this, then we order this to kind of balance that, because this thing is hot and spicy and dry. So we order some, like a tofu dish to kind of balance that out, and this tofu is cool and moist, and they just know all this stuff. And it's in the newspapers all the time, just always articles about food. Chinese people are obsessed with food. They're really into food, almost to a fault, actually. So it's important to understand that a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And there are books about that, so if you're interested, you can get books and read about Chinese medicine dietetics. And food often gets used medicinally, and dietary advice is very routine part of Chinese medicine consultation. So someone comes and they have whatever problem, and say their problem is they have some problem that's related to heat. Then the doctor is like, don't eat deep fried food and spicy food and lamb. Right? Eat more tofu and vegetables and like that. Just eat some bitter melon. And then the patient's like, oh yeah, of course, I was already doing that. Because they all know that stuff already. But in the West, when you see patients, you have to explain that. What do you mean tofu is cold? I cook it, so it's, I don't eat it out of the refrigerator, so it's not cold anymore, but its nature is cold. It has, its effect on your physiology is cooling, whatever that means, but it's a thing, it's just a weird term. And not something you can easily explain in biomedical terms, but it's still a real thing. It's just a little hard to get your mind around it, maybe. But once you do, then it's very useful. And diet and dietary advice is always given in accordance with this Chinese medicine principles. So you need a diagnosis. Like you're on the cool side, you're on the hot side, you're more damp, you're more dry. You have to make this kind of diagnosis. That's that pattern differentiation we talked about. And once you kind of know where you're at, then you can adjust your food to fit that, right? And then herbs are often used in cooking. People will just make chicken soup and put some herb in it. There's a lot of herbs are essentially food. So the line between herb and food is somewhat blurred. Just that herbs are a little more extreme and don't taste very good. But then there's ones that are kind of more in the middle that are essentially food. People do eat them as food, like, for example, lily bulb. Lily bulb, I don't know, it's not a common Western food, right? But it's a common Chinese food. And people fry it with celery. It's a very common dish. You just go to a restaurant and you get, you know, 芹菜, 炒百合, 百合 is this lily bulb. They fry the celery with lily bulb. It's herb, but it's food too. Celery is food, but it's also considered an herb. In fact, the Chinese celery is different than the Western celery. The Chinese celery is very thin, not like this big, fat Western celery. It's a little stronger tasting and a tiny bit more bitter. That's really good to lower blood pressure and reduce cholesterol. The Western celery is a little bit wimpy that way. It doesn't have much of an effect on that. It's okay. But if you can find that thin Chinese celery, which I think you can get in some Asian markets around here, you can juice that. People with high blood pressure and high cholesterol, just juice it and drink that. That will bring your blood pressure down gradually, very gradually. But people with high blood pressure would do well to drink that. Okay. So again, the line between food and herb is somewhat blurred, right? And then it's important to understand something about how the digestive system works. Without that, you kind of confused as to why Chinese medicine says you should do this or do that. You need to understand a little bit. So this is a very simplified version of Chinese medicine digestive physiology. And we say first, the food undergoes the first stage of digestion in the stomach. That's like modern medicine too, right? You eat, the food goes to the stomach. And then the spleen, that's the translation of this Chinese character pi, which probably in ancient China meant the pancreas. But in modern Chinese, it's the spleen. So it gets translated as spleen, but it really has nothing to do with your anatomical spleen. It's probably a little more closely related to the pancreas, because pancreas is not even somewhat, it's very closely related to digestive physiology, right? It just excretes some digestive enzymes, and of course the insulin comes from there, right? In any case, we say the spleen separates the essence of this food from the dregs. The essence is just all the nutritious part, right? All the whatever protein, vitamins, something like that. All that stuff gets extracted, which that happens in your intestines, right? Your intestines absorb all that stuff into the blood. And then the dregs go down into the intestines and out by the stool. But then that essence is absorbed by the intestines and used to make qi and blood. Right? That's essentially the same understanding as we have in modern medicine. It's just maybe not quite as detailed. Right? It is like that. You eat food, it goes into your stomach. The stomach has some acid and enzymes, and everything breaks down into little teeny pieces, and then that goes into your intestines, and then the intestines absorb the good part, hopefully, and that goes into the blood, and then there's some nutrition in there that helps you build more blood and help promote all your physiological processes. That's your qi, right? And then the stool comes out through the intestines, right? But in any case, the spleen and stomach like to be warm. Right? Your body's temperature is a constant, right? your body's internal temperature is a constant. It does not fluctuate except some tenths of a degree. Right? Like when you go to sleep, your body temperature goes down a couple tenths. But other than that, your body temperature is a constant, and it's pretty warm. Right? 98.6 or 37 degrees centigrade. That's pretty warm. Right? So all the physiological processes that happen in your body, they only happen because of that warmth. If you're too cold, those things stop. When you do some chemistry, it's the same thing. You're doing something in a lab. You warm things up, things happen faster. You cool everything down, everything stops. Your body is essentially the same thing. It's just like a test tube, right? All of this like chemical things happening in there. They need heat to do that, and your digestion especially likes things to be warm. Otherwise, it's impaired. And this is why there's a preference in Chinese medicine for food and drink that's warm. And that is both that physical temperature warm. Chinese people, except for some young, sort of imprudent people that don't know any better, like that absorb too much Western culture. Aside from those people, Chinese people do not take cold drinks or eat much raw food, because those things are cold and they impair digestive physiology. Some older people in China, like if you drink some ice thing in front of them, like, no, don't drink. Have hot tea. Even if it's 100 degrees out, like, you have to drink hot tea. Don't have some ice water when it's 100 degrees out. Because it actually can impair your physiology. Okay. And then the other thing about this warmth, which we'll talk about in a bit, but just very quickly, is that foods, just like herbs, they have an energetic, for lack of a better word, nature. They're either neutral, or they're on the cool or cold side, or on the warm or hot side. And what that is exactly is kind of hard to explain, but cool things tend to dampen the physiological process, or be like a very moist, for example. And warm things tend to ramp up metabolism and speed up physiological processes, and tend to be a little more on the like drying side. I'm not sure how else to explain that, but in any case, that's just this idea that in China, that's no one even needs to explain that. Like everyone just takes that idea for granted. They can't explain it either. It's just one of those things you grow up with this idea, and you never really thought about it. For example, in the West, or in English, we say, did you catch a cold? I caught a cold. But did you ever stop and think about this phrase? I caught a cold? What does that mean? Like you put on a baseball glove and like catch a cold? I mean, what is that? Right? According to modern science, it's a virus, right? A rhinovirus, and then you have an upper respiratory tract infection. But we just say you caught a cold. You generally don't think about what this term means or where it came from. It's the same thing in China with this. Tofu's cold. Spicy peppers are hot. It's just something that people take for granted. They never really thought about it that much. But that comes from Chinese medicine. And all foods have a nature. They're either somewhere on this spectrum, temperature spectrum, from cold to hot, and everything in between. All foods have a nature like that, and they affect your physiology in this way. So if you're hot, you take things that are cool. And if you're cold, you take things that are warm. That's how Chinese medicine works. And I don't have a better explanation for it than that. You just have to somehow maybe have faith in that idea. But for whatever, like Chinese people have been using that for some centuries with good results. So there's something to it. I promise you there's something to it. Just my own personal experience, which I've been doing Chinese medicine for 20 years, and more than half that time in China. And I've seen thousands and thousands of patients, and this is true. That's true. It's not just some fanciful, weird thing. It sounds weird, but it's... Okay, so then some general ideas about diet. This is very practical stuff. And this is super important because digestion is central to your physiology. That's where, in Chinese medicine, we say that's where your qi and blood come from. You eat food, and then the spleen and stomach transform it into qi and blood. And that qi and blood is what allows you to function. Without qi and blood, you die. So the digestion is central to your well-being. Right? So this is really important then, just some general principles about how to eat to promote spleen and stomach health, promote digestive function. The first thing is to eat meals at regular times. And that sounds very, I don't know, maybe not very exciting. It's not sexy, right? Like eat meals at regular times, but this is really important because your body is on a clock, in fact. You have this circadian rhythm, a biorhythm, and your body does different things at different times during the day. Right? Like at night, night and day is the most obvious difference, where at night you sleep and during the day you're awake. Clearly that's your body doing something different, right? But aside from some very obvious things like that, there's a lot of more subtle things that it's hard to really be aware of. One of them is your digestion. That's also on a clock. And your digestive system likes things to be really regular, so that it knows more or less when food is going to show up every day. So it says, if you eat breakfast at, say, 7 in the morning, then at 6:30, your digestive system is like, oh, food is coming, so I'm going to start to prepare. So the digestive juices start to flow and all of that, and then the food arrives on time, and then digestion proceeds nicely. Okay? And then same at lunch at whatever, 11:30, 12, same thing, and then dinner is at 6, something like that, right? You do that every day for your whole life, then your digestive system's really happy. Just no weird, nothing out of left field. Right? If you eat meals at different times all the time, then your stomach starts to prepare, and then the food doesn't show up. Then you have all these digestive enzymes in there, and then those things will actually start to eat away at your own tissues. So stomach acid and peptase and lipase, all these things, those things want to break things down. And if there's no food, then what? You just you get an ulcer perhaps, right? Or you eat and the stomach hasn't started to prepare that. Then you have all this food in there, and there's nothing in there to start digesting it, and things start to rot. So if you're all over the place with your meal times, you just wear your body down over time. It's not like you do that once and it's all over. But if you do that throughout the course of your lifetime, you just put undue strain on your body. And you're kind of, if you think about your longevity as a string, and you got like, this is what your potential is. This is how long you could live, a string. If you live really even, and that string is flat, very even like that, then it's really long. But if you do all this kind of stuff, irregular, that string gets shorter and shorter and shorter. You just shorten your years.